Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode, and we will discuss on the energy transition readiness, which is very important for today's world because of artificial intelligence, and we need a lot of energy and everything. So we have our world famous speaker, Mr. Rob Enderley, and we have Madam Ali Rice. So first, I want to know like how you want to define energy transition readiness for today's sessions, Mr. Rob.
Well, energy transition readiness really implies doing the work, the process changes, the assessments of your existing power generation sources, and coming up with a plan, and then making sure everybody's on board with regard to the execution of the plan. Would you and often that's where it falls apart a bit. Because often the power sources, coal, the traditional sources, coal, oil, natural gas, and other petroleum sources are those sources are a part of the decision making process. They contribute to government. They do employ people, some cases large numbers of people in some communities, and they tend to jump out of the boat at some particular point when you're trying to do this. And so making sure that they're part of the solution and not part of the problem is part and parcel to actually getting this stuff done. But it's all about getting the parts you can get ready for the transition. Doing things like taking a hard look at the grid and seeing what the process would be to make it bidirectional. Currently grids are one directional, that you've got your centralized power sources and you push them out to businesses and homes. Well, with the advent of when you're putting in solar, wind, and the rest, you want to be able to use those resources to contribute to the grid. But if the grid's only one directional, it's not going to work really well. So really putting in place the plans and particularly the support to get the transition done.
Thank you. Madam Ali Rice, how you want to define energy transition readiness, and if you share some of your experience from Europe, that will be helpful for our audience.
Well, I think that, the transition here is already happening. So I think there's like at least 50% of our energy that's sustainably gained through solar or wind farms. So I think it is happening, but I think the petrochemical industry and the way that we've always done things has a massive stronghold, because we still most of us all have a vehicle in the family, at least one, if not two. So I think and I think so we had an electric vehicle a few years ago, and the infrastructure is probably not there for everyone to have an EV. So I think there needs to be other ways of doing things. And if you live in a rural area like we do, if you rely on public transportation, it's really unreliable, and it doesn't necessarily take you to where you need to go. So it's for kind of the convenience and just kind of staying to time and doing everything you need to do, having your own vehicles the most important thing, really. So I think it's just kind of that autonomy, really, so that you can go where you need to go and do the school run and do whatever you need to. So I think the thing is that I think we're kind of heading in the right direction, but there needs to be a real strong kind of bound, a commitment from all the countries that signed up to the Paris Agreement. And I think obviously the US has pulled out of most of those. So I think, as that's always been kind of one of the lead nations, I think other people need to kind of, take the reins and kind of lead on anyway, because it makes a difference. Since Ukraine and Russia are at war as well, it's hit our kind of economy and our energy prices massively. So I think the thing is to have, there's so many houses that have kind of solar panels in this area, even though we don't particularly get kind of warm weather all year round. We get lots of sunshine even in the winter. So I think the thing is that, and the fact you can build a passive house and it can send energy back is incredible. So I think, I think we should adopt kind of ways of kind of doing things differently, so that new homes are kind of sustainable and they don't. There was another thing that was on TV the other day. association homes. I think they've done a partnership with an energy company, and those homes that they've just moved into don't cost them anything. So I think there's heat pumps that not only heat the house but also send energy to the grid. So yeah, so I think it's really exciting, but we should have probably kind of thought about things when we did things as opposed to
Okay, thank you.
recklessly. Because I just think the thing is that there's free power, but I think the power it's in the energy company's interest for people to pay for it. So I think we need to kind of alter the way that we do things. So it's not about profiteering; it's about enabling people to live more sustainably, so that they can use, their incomes on other things. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. My next question for Mr. Rob, and we are discussing about preparedness and how prepared are developing and emerging economy to adapt large-scale renewable energy system, considering their current infrastructure gap and financial constraint. If you analyzing these things, like what happened in Silicon Valley or in California, and how we can improve, if you give some strategic outcome from your discussion, yeah. Can you unmute, please? Yeah.
I'm not sure I'd use the United States as a good example for energy conversion, and probably use the Scandinavian countries instead. But I think you can showcase us as a cautionary tale. We didn't get the adequate support to make the conversion, and right now we're kind of on a backlash at the moment, where the current administration is discontinuing funding of alternative energy sources, green energy sources, and trying to get people to drill for more oil. So we're actually going in the wrong direction at the moment, because we didn't do a good job of assuring that the support was there to drive through the conversion. As I said before, this support part is really important. I mean, you can take coal miners and you can turn them into geothermal drilling technicians. You can take auto mechanics and turn them into EV high voltage specialists. You can turn offshore oil workers and offshore wind farm technicians and transition the workforce, but we didn't do that. So the end result is that we're currently experiencing a rather large amount of blowback. When we're talking about emerging economies, you can kind of learn from what we didn't do, and really put in the foundational elements first. Make sure that the people that are at risk of the transition are brought along with the transition, and are still viable afterwards. You just have to take care of the folks. Other things you have to do is you have to make sure you're not creating bigger new problems than the old problems you're trying to solve. For instance, cobalt and lithium and nickel they do a lot of damage when you're mining them. And so if you're going to go to a battery first, electric first ecosystem, you really need to put in place early on a circular economy, so these things are recycled, so you're not continuing to do damage to the environment by extracting them. And that can be done, and clearly a lot of the nations are doing that now. But that wasn't done up front, and the end result was a lot of discussion of, for instance, whether EVs were truly green or just a different kind of pollution. And initially, even though they were greener than gas, even at their worst, they still that counter argument made it so that people that weren't buying EVs felt, well, it's kind of a no-brainer. If the EVs are worse, then no, why am I going in this direction? And we don't like change to begin with. So it allowed the petrochemical industry to really push back very effectively against the EV expansion, at least here and some other places. So if you're going to do it, you really need to approach this holistically, and make sure that the secondary impacts, the collateral damage is minimized, both to the workforce and as a result of the new materials that you're using to create very different technology.
Thank you. Thank you. Madam Ali Rice, what you want to share from Europe, how prepared are developing or emerging technologies, and what the energy-related strategy you want to share from your experience?
Well, I think the policy and regulation needs to be there, so there's kind of clarity, and there needs to be kind of long-term vision and goals, so that there's a legal bind to meet targets, and so that we're aware that that we're diminishing our emissions, and So I think the grid system needs to be more flexible as well. This is from some of the research that I did. So because apparently there's kind of a backlog of and there needs to be kind of a digitalization so that there's a real time visibility of usage, and so, and it's I think just kind of putting the capital and the funding behind it. So in the long term, we obviously we gain more energy, but we don't pollute. So I just think it's that funding and allocation, and having a long term view as opposed to a short term kind of return, really. And that's so that's probably the same with emerging countries and communities as well. That that it needs to you need to look at the long kind of time, really, as opposed to looking at short term measures that are easy. So I think and I think there's lots of opportunities that are coming. So there's lots of houses in this area that were given retrofitting, so they put insulation on the outside of the houses. They were old. I think they were old kind of council houses that they did it to, and they transformed the look of the buildings. But they also meant that they were so well insulated that they barely needed any heat. So but I think that's another. It's another kind of. It's a cost, a short-term kind of high cost, but in the long term, it's much better, so that it saves so much money on the bill. So I think it's kind of looking at a long-term view as opposed to the short term.
Thank you. Mr. David Smith, as you are working for Albion, you heavily developing data centers and bringing all of the investment. Country like Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and all of the South Asian countries, they have to go for policy reformations for these energy sectors, right? So what policy reforms are most urgent for a country to become energy transition ready? And how can government balance economic growth with decarbonization?
Well, it's a great question because some of the most urgent parts needed for energy transition is really policy reforms, and particularly around how do you create a stable but adaptive framework that can help unlock the investments that are needed to accelerate innovation and include mechanisms where you can balance economic growth with the sustainability focus on flexibility and support for the affected communities. And this is where a system of systems and a whole system thinking has to apply as you look at this. So from the policy frameworks, one of the keys to your question is the government and regulatory bodies implementing long-term predictable policies for renewable energy deployment, of how you set up auctions, tariffs, renewable targets, how you do carbon pricing, how do you put clear regulatory pathways in place that are stable enough to attract investment and enable planning. And you have to invest very strategically in your grid upgrades, in your transmission expansion. And one of the big new things is in your storage. And how do you digitize the entire part of this modernized industry energy infrastructure? Because you have to do it to enable integration of renewables at scale. You have to do it to be able to have micro and mini grids as part of this new infrastructure. You have to do it as a way to, with many of the sustainable technologies, implement storage. The old systems where I was coming from a coal fire or an oil fired generator, you didn't store, you just generated more power or less power. We now need storage as we look at these others. How do you support research and development to help commercialize these technologies, particularly as you look at industries where they've been slow to adapt or they have not even thought about these questions yet? And as Shreve, as we see in most of the problem sets we discuss with you, is how do we do the education and the training for workforces to transitioning them to this, to provide reskilling programs, social safety nets in some, and regional development assistance for the communities, for the workers, for the companies which are impacted by these transitions. A great example here is coal closures that really impacted us heavily, but were good for the environment. And how do we look at the whole front end side of this? How do we look at the permitting that's needed for this? How do we look at the rules to connect all of these things to the grid, and what is allowed and what's not allowed? How do we put protections in place to protect the grid? Because as we put more and more of these types of resources on the grid from a number of different places, the grid becomes at risk, because people where when the grid was owned by a single company, it was more easy to protect. With all of this, it is becoming much more risky as we begin to see with the number of outages and things we see all time. So, it's really, you have to look at these reforms from this systems view, and from the system of systems view, because it's pretty clear that these are connected across multiple elements. And how do you do and put these frameworks in place, but protecting the stability and protecting the economic growth that is necessary for these upgrades to support it? And Sharif, I think that hopefully answers your question.
Thank you. Mr. Rob, you are also part of strategy. So policy application and policy analysis is a major important area for emerging economy. So what's your thoughts? How country like Bangladesh or India, or they can reform their policy?
Well, I think part of looking at how to reform policies, I know we talk about artificial technology here on and off, but really kind of embracing a much more holistic view in terms of information access, and discovering best practices, and kind of implementing a sense of knowledge-based decisions as they move forward. In other words, learn from the mistakes of others and really put together a framework that better assures success. Look at some of the things that countries like Norway have done, which is a petrochemical company, and yet they've been able to make a conversion, which should have been incredibly difficult, and undoubtedly was there, but they did it successfully. So look at where the success is, it has been, and use that to inform the policies they have. And as David pointed out, and I mentioned as well, the making sure that you bring the populace along with you in your transition. The mistakes that were made early on was try to dictate the changes and not really get the internal support needed to make those changes happen, or at least assure those changes would happen across administrations. Because it doesn't do a lot of good to have one set of folks dictate a significant change to help and save the planet, and not only the planet in your own country, only to have the people completely out of the boat and vote out that administration, or replace them with an administration, which is what we have here, that isn't on board with these changes at all. And so all the progress that's done gets undone, and you end up just wasting money as opposed to moving forward. So really assuring that the people are behind the underlying effort, and making sure you've learned from the mistakes of other countries and don't feel the need to remake them yourselves, which sadly is often what happens.
Madam Aliraj, do you want to add some point about this policy reformations? And
kind of really what Rob said, really, and it's make do is learn from the mistakes that the West have made and do things differently. So it's much more easy to put systems in place that are already so that their goal end is to be sustainable than it is to try and turn a whole industry around to do things differently. So that should be the main goal, really, is it's sustainable for our region. So and it's not doing it to make sure that everybody has access to the same resources in life.
thank you. So David, my next question for you: how can industry that traditional carbon intensive, such as steel, cement, or transport, transition to the clean energy without increasing production cost of for consumer.
And in some ways, as you look at those industries, the increase, as you look across some of the studies that have been done, they've been very minor at the end of it. Some of the global analysis showed that if you use a smart coordinated approach, it's less than 1% of the end prices. So you see there, but there is an impact in the end pricing there. But some of the strategies is to really scale up first with some of the mature technologies. You know, develop energy efficient upgrades. And as you look at motors, as you look at heating, as you look at other things, and look at processes where there's cost competitive renewable energy. And that's one of the places where the mini grids and microgrids, or particularly with the industries you mentioned, Sharif, come into play. One of the very interesting one is the use of hydrogen. So there's hydrogen-based steel making there. We're seeing increasingly hydrogen generation used in data centers because of how its input. And that hydrogen is going to be one. You can also expand the circular economy by looking at some of the recycling rates, particularly for steel, where it is less energy and cost intensive than producing raw primary production from stock. Leverage policy incentives and public-private partnerships. We've seen across many governments where production tax credits, low interest green loans to offset capital, and all of these help reduce the prices passed on to consumers. And particularly as you go back and look at how to implement recycling into the industry, that type of recycling and the whole circular economy plays there. You can also look at ways which we've seen in many times, but I think we're beginning to shift away from it, is you can drive costs down through scaling. And you support collaborative procurements, industrial alliances, supply chain partnerships to accelerate this type of change you're talking about, Dr. Sharif, because when you drive economics of scale and technology, you typically see cost reductions. And again, encourage global standards and common specifications. So many of these products are linked to local production, and you do not have the ability to work on standards and common specifications, which is, again, a way to reduce cost in the long term. And how do you balance the differences between the hardest to solve emissions, which are important to those industries? And so we need to invest more and more into research and development around the hard problem sets, because those hard problem sets need collaborative, I believe, global research to be able to solve many of them. Because, you see that there's just so many places within each of those industries where we can have an impact, and we can approach it on a part piecemeal basis and see dramatic results. We can look at it as a total system and see results, but it is a hard problem set. And we need really a systematic way to cooperate, to set policies, to set industry standards, to set industry commitments to innovate. And we can do this with hopefully maintaining pricing and targeting, because the ability to collaborate, and particularly do the research and development that's needed to make step function increases in those industries, Dr. Sharif, is very important for the world going forward. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rob Enderle, what's your thoughts about this questions how can industry that are traditional carbon intensive, specifically steel, cement, and transport, which is very active industries in South Asia because of Belt and Road Initiative, transitions to the clean energy without increasing production cost of consumer, because cost effectiveness is very important for energy transition. What's your thought?
Well, yeah, and as I mentioned before, it's in some cases it's just a case of retraining and repositioning the employees in the industry because the industry isn't capable. But in this particular case, with regard to cement, there are certainly better formulations now that allow for you to use cement that is less destructive in its creation process, and you can look at that. But you're right, there are cost elements to that, which would require offsetting subsidies. As we've certainly discovered in the past, if there's much of a cost delta, even though the technology is greener, often the industry will continue to use the cheaper technology because the cost of the damage is in transition to them. Now you can do things like use taxing authority to tax the industries that are creating the problem in the first place, forcing the change. But again, if you're competing across borders, that just makes that industry less competitive in the global market and probably won't sustain itself. So it's probably better to use incentives to keep the cost of the green approach effective, or the green approach, the materials that are created through the green approach effective or cost effective, and then look for ways to lower the cost over time. Perhaps by looking at the core elements and to see if they can be derived from inside the country as opposed to being shipped from outside. And often that's the case as you make the conversion. For instance, hemp as a stabilizing material for cement has been very effective, and hemp is considered a relatively green element. And most of the emerging economies can grow hemp without any trouble at all. And it has broader uses. You can use hemp, for instance, to replace wood pulp for paper, and it arguably it's a lot better because you want to leave your trees alone whenever possible. So looking at creative ways to use greener technologies that can be produced, that use materials that can be produced in country cheaply, providing incentives to help make the transition, but making sure that those incentives will age out. Because if you have to constantly incentivize an industry to be price competitive, long term, that's probably not going to work. The industry has to be self-supporting, and that means you have to transition the supply to that industry to make the conversion. We're always going to need steel, but there are undoubtedly better ways to create it. I'm not an expert on steel by any stretch of the imagination. But with regard to cement, I have looked at it, and there are ways to create cement that's substantially greener, and that you can use materials that are often locally sourced. And if you build up to an economy of scale, in theory, you should be able to bring the prices over time in line with the older methods, and include within it, as both Dave and I pointed out, retraining when necessary, and do subsidize the conversion, do subsidize the retraining. But make sure the plan is to make the industry price competitive, eventually price competitive, so the subsidies retire. Otherwise, you can have problems in the future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Madam Ali-Rais, what's your advice for this transport industries and cement and these construction industries?
Well, so definitely cement. I know about the hemp cement, but one of my favourite programs is called Grand Designs, and I think there are problems with it, and that it needs, especially in this country, as it needs to have dry weather to dry out. But I think that's obviously in hotter countries that wouldn't be a problem. You know, years and years ago, Jason and I worked on this project, and they built a house in the middle of Birmingham city centre, and they built it using mud bricks, and they got really hard, and I think it cost them like £300. But I think the thing is that you need to be resourceful with the resources you have, and essentially you just need to make choices that are more green and kind of go in a different direction. So really you need to innovate and do things differently, and I think that's fundamentally the way forward. And you know, transitioning transport it's obviously kind of going to be based on green energy, and the thing is that I don't know whether there's solar power that can impact trade. I just think in third world or emerging countries, that to have transport to get to A to B is kind of like a privilege. Really, I remember one of my friends was originally from Nairobi, and she said that people were paid so poorly that they either ran home and spent all their money, or they get a bus. And essentially, I don't think necessarily some things have changed that much. So I think kind of living kind of hand to mouth like that is something that's hard to imagine for a lot of people that live in the West. But I just think that people need to kind of look at things differently. And a lot of the times those innovations happen in countries and in communities where that problem needs to be resolved. So yeah, so I think there's, it's very specific depending on which region you're in.
Thank you. Let's focus on finance and cooperations. Mr. David Smith, you are expert for financing, strategy development, and so on. So, what role should international cooperations, climate finance, and technology transfer play in accelerating the global South readiness for the clean energy future? What's your thought?
Dr. Sharif, you're asking a multi-part question, which is really good. So you have to have, as you say in the question, the international cooperation has to really be tied together to work there on how to accelerate this. So, you need to facilitate knowledge and best practice exchange. Particularly as you look at how to share successful policy, successful technology, and successful business models, and really give guidance on how to take these best practices and tailor them to the local context that are there. How do you accelerate the learning and adaptation and application of these without reinventing the wheel? One of the places I think you're going to see more and more is we're going to see smart infrastructure grids come into place. And we're going to begin to see more regional grid integration, more cross-border grid integration, cross-border energy trading, and particularly in areas such as storage, which I think, as I said before, is going to be one of the big future growth areas. I've mentioned multiple times mini microgrids, particularly ones where you can use local resources such as maybe geothermal, such as hydrogen production and others to complement and build this area so that you can use more elements of the ecosystem together and work there. You're going to have to build some really strong partnerships, both commercial partnerships, government partnerships, and public-private partnerships to foster how to work together across the technopolis, where you can develop these partnerships between governments, commercial companies, banks, academia, and the private sector to create aligned strategies and to lever synergies towards shared clean energy goals. And how do you address the role of finance? Is it mostly government? Is it mostly NGOs? Is it corporate financing? Is it traditional financing? How do you mobilize and de-risk this type of financing for this infrastructure and technology development? Particularly in this area where private capital is hesitant to invest because of perceived risk in it. And how do you support the capacity building and institutional strengthening? How do you get the institutions to understand that they're in a time of transition and where this transition is going to be transformational to their industry? How do you look at the reforms that are necessary? And how do you look at the whole role of the new technologies? And as I spoke about before, there needs to be some more considerable research and development, particularly as we look at the hard problems. So the whole area of technology transfer, which is near and dear to me, has to be part of this. So how do you accelerate the technology transfer and adoption of advanced clean technologies? Because you need to bridge the gap by providing access to proven technologies. But on the other hand, with the new smart grids, the green hydrogen technologies, and others, how do you transition to those? You know, we're seeing now the production of not only small nuclear reactors, micro nuclear reactors, we're now seeing the production, very early stage, of very small fusion reactors. How do we bring those in? Because those are innovations that can help here. And how do we look at the market on this one? Uh, it's a very complex market in the industries you see that for us, Dr. Shree. And how do we take traditional markets and transition them for the transformation to what they need to be next generation? And that's the problem that you're really talking about here, is how to pull this complex system together and prepare it to move to their next generation of what they need to become.
Mhm. Thank you. Mr. Robin Deldy, what's your thoughts specifically? What role should international cooperation, climate finance, technology transfer play accelerating the global south readiness for a clean energy futures? And if you have any views from North America, especially for energy sector.
One thing I'm not sure you should be using this as an example, but at least not at the moment. But with regard to I'm glad you asked what should happen as opposed to what will happen, because should and will are two very different things at the moment. But really, what should happen is there should be a global effort to recognize that pollution is everybody's problem. For instance, a lot of pollution in California comes from China, so it really behooves the world to really think about the fact that this pollution moves. It moves by air, moves by water, and of course, ocean pollution affects us all. We're all experiencing an uptick in mercury, in particular, in our seafood, and not to mention microplastics, which is damaging and part and parcel to the petrochemical sources for our energy, because this is what makes plastic so cheap. Is they're a byproduct of petroleum use. So that you get rid of the petroleum use, then plastics suddenly don't become all that economical anymore, and the problem kind of solves itself. What these countries should do is they should use their budgets that are supposed to be in place to protect their citizenship, and spread the money effectively. Certainly they've been in programs in the past, and a lot of times you find out after the fact there's been a significant amount of graft, self-dealing, and what you're expecting the programs to do is to solve the underlying problem, not make a bunch of foreigners rich. And with no real progress in the problem you're trying to solve. So there have to be controls on the money that's spent. And part of I think why a lot of countries kind of soured on this was the ability to really assure that the monies that were being donated to help emerging countries to get their act in order weren't being spent for that. They were going in other directions. And don't get me wrong, we're not just blaming the people in those other countries, but the politicians and folks that are administrating the programs in the countries that were donating the money. There were problems across the ecosystem. And so you've got to assure the ecosystem that you're putting in place, but it makes absolute sense for countries that would otherwise be spending money to mitigate the damage that's being done. Healthcare costs go up. You have climate migrations, which is what a lot of countries are experiencing at the moment, and creating large influxes of climate refugees. And the end result is that's incurring a lot of costs. Well, if you can take the money, project out, and instead of taking that money you're going to spend and just burning it, because you're just mitigating a problem, you're not solving it. Use those funds to help solve the problem in the countries that have the underlying issues, help them improve their agricultural base, help them with their own transitions, so that you don't have these secondary problems of pollution and excessive immigration to deal with in your own country. If people don't want to move in large numbers because they can't live where they are, then that's one less problem that your folks have to deal with. But sadly, most politicians don't really think strategically, and the systems aren't really designed that way. That they're taught to think tactically, and so it's really hard to justify a lot of these programs tactically, because even if you do it successfully, it can take years for the benefits to flow through. And often the politicians that back these programs aren't around anymore when the programs reach fruition. And so they don't get the focus and emphasis that otherwise would be the case, except for those politicians that are forward looking and are really there to help the people. And sadly, we don't have enough of those. And so in the end, I think it comes down to what, as you said, what countries should do is they should be funding emerging economies to come aboard and making sure that the polluting elements are reduced globally. But right now, doing so both effectively and strategically has been problematic.
Thank you. Madam Ali Rice, what's your advice specifically for international cooperation, climate finance, technology transfer, and if you want to add some point for women entrepreneurs for Global South, that will be helpful for energy business.
Yeah. Well, sustainably, if you look at your community first, essentially, a lot of people have solar panels so that they can produce their own energy. So essentially, I think it's better to look kind of community rather than the other way around. And for me, when I spent time in Malaysia, the reason I went there is because my sister was living over there with her husband, who's in the petrochemical industry. And one of the things that worries me is lots of areas. Is that, they're still building new plants now for the petrochemical industry, and they're building them, in places of natural beauty, and that they're obviously providing jobs, but they're continuing to add to the problem. So essentially, I'd argue that the West also has a responsibility in doing things differently. So they pilot projects that do produce sustainable energy that isn't derived from polluting the so I think the thing is that because the West has caused so much pollution, I think we should be part of the solution to turn things around. So I think there should be and for me it just feels like the the petrochemical industry just profiteers and kind of takes advantage of developing countries to utilize those resources. So so for me, that there should be a massive windfall tax on the on the petrochemical industries anyway, because they have so many profits, and essentially that should be, I think their windfall taxes should be pushed into the emerging economies so that they develop other projects that are innovating and doing what we're talking about, so that they enable that transition to happen. That's what I think they should do.
Thank you. Mr. David Smith, how can communities, especially in the rural and marginalized region, be included in the energy transition so that the shift to renewables also improve livelihood and climate resilience? That South Asia has effect on climate change and all of the things. I can understand the North American, like Trump, do not like this climate initiative or everything. So what's your thoughts? How we can create a proper ecosystem?
Sharif, I love your extra clarification there, because the problems you describe in Asia and others are actually very similar to here as we look at the rural and in the regions that are there. And one of the first answers, and this is almost a so blatantly obvious answer, but it's going to be difficult to do, is we have to adapt our grids. We're going to have to adapt our infrastructure to be able to include them all. It's like when the telephone was invented, rural areas did not get it at all. in some parts of the rural areas, both in the United States and others, still do not have landline telephones as you look at it. But then we saw wireless technology come over, which made it easier. And even with that technology, we could not get internet to many others. And now we have satellite internet that can reach those areas. So it's all how the infrastructure has changed. We need to do the same thing with energy here, is we need to look at ways to upgrade our infrastructure in a way that makes sense. There's Nikola Tesla demonstrated a long time ago, and now we have companies producing this wireless energy transmission. That is a technology that might be able to be applied in these areas and showing really promising results. There's a company not far from me in Dallas that has now shown transmitting fairly large amounts of energy wirelessly from Central Texas here down to Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic that can be used during disasters. But we're going to see technologies like that. The other place that kind of makes sense on this, Dr. Sharif, and I'm going to go back to one of the technologies I talked about earlier, is the mini microgrids. And why does that make sense here? Is if I'm in a rural area that is highly involved with farming and ranching, the byproducts of those can be used to produce energy. So I can take the byproducts of the animals, I can take the byproducts of the farming and put those and transfer them into energy to serve those areas. And that is where the concept of being able to put more and more people who can interject energy on the grid is going to become important. And these mini microgrids, you tend to have, like with data networks, firewalls, gateways between them and the larger grids. And that was one of the things that can help include the rural areas and others in this transformation there. And one of the other things that's kind of interesting is when we've looked at the bio clusters and things of converting the agricultural waste and the animal waste, it creates new jobs for the people in those regions. It creates new products for the farmers, for the ranchers, to supplement what they're making on their farms, is by being able to sell those resources and in return get a product back that they need. And so you put yourself in, again, this circular ecosystem there that really helps the rural communities to do that. I mean, I can tell you here where I live in Austin, it's really hard for me to go into a bio plant and put animal manure, to put plant waste and things into it, and do that here. But if I'm in a rural community where those are very abundant in things, it's much, much easier to do. And a rural community or a marginalized community, Dr. Sharif, it's easier to galvanize regulatory support for it. Even though it wasn't very effective, in the last presidential administration here, there was considerable funds put into place to take broadband internet and fiber into the rural communities. Very little of it got deployed, but there was money allocated for that, and it fell down on the execution. We can do the same thing globally to there. But really, I think one of the keys is looking at the local strengths of these rural environments and being able to use what is produced there as waste and other, and put that back into the sustainable environment and use that to create their own mini and microgrids to make them sustainable and to control their costs.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mr. Rob Winderly, what's your response about this communities, especially in the rural and marginalized region, be included in the energy transition so that the shift to renewable energy also improve livelihood and climate resilience?
Well, I think part and parcel of this is first engaging with them to see what it is that they need. Different environments need different things, and a lot of times when you're moving to more localized power generation, what you're doing is you're providing somebody with a much more stable resource. Particularly in emerging countries, the centralized power resource is very unreliable, and you have lots of power outages because the grid is so fragile. And so part of this is an education process to both to bring people up into how to maintain the equipment, but in terms of the benefits of having it localized. I remember Qualcomm, no, it wasn't Qualcomm, it was a Cisco effort a while back. They were looking at wells in Africa and the problem of polluted wells, and it was largely an educational problem where the folks are putting their waste disposal way too close to the wells, and so the wells are becoming polluted over time and creating significant health issues. Not to mention the well equipment, well pumps were just not designed to operate in areas that had no maintenance. And so they came up with both an educational process to inform the population on where best to place wells and protect them, and then put in place solar infrastructure that was more robust, along with training to maintain it. And the end result were wells that remained clean and functional for extended periods of time because they were maintained by the community, not by some obscure government agency that didn't really want to go these extreme distances in hostile territory to maintain an infrastructure that wasn't designed for the environment that it was placed into, and you got a positive result. And there are a lot of examples of this. Cisco actually went around the world doing similar projects like this: wells in one place, manufacturing, distribution technology, another, actually internet technology, another. There were communities, I think it was in South America, that were creating these handcrafted arts, but they weren't going anyplace because they didn't know how to market or distribute them. So they trained them in web resources and gave them put in place wireless technology, again with training to maintain it, to allow these folks to promote their localized industries. And suddenly they had sales and money coming in, and with sales and money coming in, then they can afford to do things like put in solar panels and windmills and the rest to get power. And so that made the community more self-sustaining, and along with that self-sustaining capability, they were able to afford the kinds of things that were allowed them to modernize their internal grid, actually put in place in some cases the grid to begin with because they're very isolated, and then increase education and bring the community up. So instead of being dependent on the nation, it was a contributor to the nation. It looked certainly much more self-sufficient. And it does require really, again, thinking through the problem. The goal isn't to provide long-term subsidies in any stretch of the imagination. The goal is to make every change you make self-sustaining. And if you don't do the self-sustaining part, it won't last. And so when you're talking about bringing in a lot of these communities to showcase the benefits of being self-sustaining, of being able to, instead of always having your hand out asking for money that'll never arrive, you're now generating your own income. And then you have discretion over how that money is spent. And a lot of cases, they'll spend that money to improve their own infrastructure because that improves their quality of life. And so you get this beneficial circle, if you will, where things get better as opposed to a Band-Aid approach, which is the more typical approach that works marginally well. And then when the Band-Aid goes away, you're back, if not just as bad as you were before, but oftentimes worse because you created dependencies on technologies that no longer function. So that's the way to approach it and bring the community along, is really think about the sustaining impact on the community and make it much more self-supporting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Madam Ali Rice, what's your advice for community development, and what's your closing remarks for today?
I think when I did the research that I did, I think that one of the things that's going to happen is that the awareness to change things is there. But I think there's a massive difference between leaders that they're actually doing something and putting it in, as applying the changes that need to be made, and those that don't give it any priority really. And I think in developing countries and emerging countries, that communities, that they are the ones that probably have the power to kind of to demonstrate best practice and do something, and then it can kind of expand. So I think and it goes back to kind of doing things differently instead of trying to do what the West has done really. So for me, it's kind of adapting to climate change, and utilizing the resources that are there is really important. And there's always a way to kind of figure out what you need to do, and sometimes it's easier to do what you need to do when when the resources are kind of less than it is if you've got all this stuff that's available to you. And the easiest option is to do something that does pollute the environment. So I think the thing is, so I just think innovating is really important, and I think that best practice is one of the things that people need to look at and do. So definitely there's communities that I know within the area that have put in their own wind turbines or solar panels as a community, so that they are completely self-reliant and don't rely on the grid. So and I think there's with the heat pumps and things like that, because obviously in the UK we get really cold in the winter, but we also at the moment we get really hot temperatures in the summer as well. So that we have to kind of cover insulating our houses and keeping them cool in the summer as well. So but for the most part we don't have to worry about air conditioners and things, because we live in such a moderate climate. And obviously in a warmer climate, that they have to combat droughts and a lack of rain for months. So it's really different. But I think that kind of local ability to change and have leaders that have give priority to sustainable choices is really important.
Thank you. Mr. David Smith, what's your closing remarks for today's sessions?
Dr. Shreve, it's very fun on this one because this is a really important discussion that has dynamics that are difficult to understand. And it's clear that the energy transformation and transitions we're looking at represent some very consequential challenges and opportunities we have of our time. It's more than a shift in technology, though. It really is a fundamental reshaping of some of our economies, our society, our governments, our way we look at the relationship between academia, regulation, corporate growth, innovation, and really it's the relationship with our society and the planet. So we're at a critical junction where choices we're making today and research decisions and educational decisions and others will define some of our future generations. And it's going to take some bold commitments. We need to look at innovation across all these areas. We need to look at ways to bring innovative, collaborative research to bear to solve particularly the hard problem sets. And we need to have the collaboration between the technopolis, the government, the industry, the academic, the communities, and really redefined our view of how society works across that whole area. And for example, the intelligent smart cities are an example of where we're going. We need to do the same things we look at energy like this. And the moment really calls for us to look at our responsibility forging energy systems that are not only low carbon and sustainable, but accessible, and look at how we can do it across all of the stakeholders. I mean, we see technologies that can be used in urban areas. In the last question you asked, I talked about some technologies that could be used in very rural areas. We also need to look at transitional technologies. One of my favorite is there's a company that is putting small generators on trains and putting cars on trains that are nothing but batteries that while the train's moving across the country, it charges these batteries, and at each stop, they transition the charged batteries for uncharged ones and using that type of kinetic energy to generate power. So it's really one that's looking across all of our systems that can do this. And our solutions in this area are reachable. We need to look at scalable technologies, innovative finance areas that can help fund it, both public and private. We need to look at smart policy and collective actions that can push this. And we have to accelerate our efforts on this and foster partnerships that put it in place, because our resolve is to create a solution that's affordable, that is sustainable, not only for this generation, but for those to become after us. And Dr. Sharif, I appreciate your leadership as we look at this problem going forward and how it can be used to solve the future problems. So thank you for allowing me to be part of the discussion.
Thank you. I request all of our audience, please share our content with the government agency, corporation, and academia. Besides that, World Talent Economic Forum institutions, definitely with the help of all of our colleagues like Professor David Smith, Ali Rice, Rob Enderle, we are providing consulting for this urban planning. So I think this session is very, very valuable. Those who are developing cities and energy related activities and all of the things. And the government agency also can learn a lot of things from today's session. Thank you, Professor David Smith, for your continuous support for World Talent Economic Forum. And thank you, Madam Ali Rice, for your continuous support. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.